The bells of the great sept moved, as if reluctant to disturb the heat. Dawn came thin and wavering over King's Landing, light the color of watered wine, and all along the street of flour the ovens breathed. The air was heavy with yeast and ash, and the sweet scorch of crusts. Pigeons were already quarreling on cornices and windowsills. From the Hook to the river gate, the city exhaled yesterday's smoke, and today's hopes. And the sound trembled faintly up the hill to the Red Keep, where the first banners scarcely stirred. Cersei Lannister stood on the balcony outside her solar and watched the roofs take the sun. The terracotta and slate seemed to soften in the light. The chimneys were needles. The masts in the Blackwater were bare lances. She held a cup of black wine that had cooled while she ignored it. Sleep had entered her chambers and gone again without touching her. The city felt as it had in those thin days after her father's funeral, on the verge of speaking the wrong truth aloud. She could almost hear Tywin's measured footfall in her thoughts, the way he would stand just inside, the way he would draw breath to shape the day. The door opened. Pycelle's rustling beard arrived before his eyes, and with him, the faint waxy scent of old parchment and oils. "Your Grace," he said, lowering himself, gathering his sleeves like a man saving silk from a spill, "the council hour is near. Shall I send for bread? I can smell bread from here," she said. "It seems the small folk will eat today." "By the generosity of the Reach, no doubt," Pycelle murmured. He had the wary look of one accustomed to being swatted. Crates arrived at dawn. The Tyrells do nothing without their name pinned to it. She set her cup aside. A breeze rose that could not be felt elsewhere in the room, and carried up the faintest of scents, roses crushed with mint. She did not turn to see it. She knew it. Margaery's perfume clung to corridors, hours after the girl passed. "Prepare the chamber. I'll be down presently." When Pycelle had retreated, she looked again over the city. The sept was a pale mountain in the haze. White doves cooed upon its ledges, and the Seven's faces glowed placid as bone. In the forecourt, the usual knot of ragged penitents knelt with hands outstretched. Sparrows, the people called them, because they were small and inoffensive and everywhere. They had been there before, and they would be there after. They muttered and begged and fell down weeping when a priest intoned mercy. But they did not rise in numbers or clench into a fist. The High Septon remained in his chambers, heavy in rings, heavy in appetite, his great sapphire star anchored like a drop of summer sky at his breast. He loved the king and the mother. He loved warm baths and sugared fruits. He loved the silence of a city that obeyed. Cersei drew her hand along the cold stone of the balustrade and imagined it warmer. She had contemplated, not so many weeks past, the convenience of piety sharpened by steel. Rearmament would have given her new pieces on the board, devout men who could arrest where gold did not persuade. She had held that thought up to the light, as one might a jewel. Then she had turned it and seen its edges. Swords given to piety became piety's swords. And piety did not love Lannisters, not really. Piety loved its own image in water. She had not gone to the High Septon with Tywin's calm offer. She had not spoken of Tommen's soul. She had not woken something that would be hard to put back to sleep. She left the balcony as the sun mounted. Handmaidens trailed her like ribbon. Steel-shod feet sounded on the stairs below. A pair of gold cloaks tried to look as if they had not been gossiping. In the throne room, she took her chair, not the high, mad thing of melted blades, but the lower seat for those who serve the king because he is a child. Tommen's crown gleamed on the cushion. Tommen's cat was barred from the hall when the court met. The boy himself would not come until she sent. Still, she saw him in her mind, soft as pastry, and too ready to smile. He had a goodness in him that would be a weakness if permitted. Margaery had already found it. Cersei had seen the way the girl's hand lay on his, not a wife's possession. Not yet, but the gesture a mother uses for a son frightened of thunderstorms. The council arrived in a procession of character and upholstery. Pycelle, Qyburn, graceful in his unbecomingness. Mace Tyrell in satins like a fruit market. He waddled under his weight of offices and tassels, rehearsing something to do with lists and ships. Kevin came as if he would rather have walked somewhere else. Stoic, and serviceable. The chairs took them. The air thinned. "We begin?" said Circe. "The harbor?" 5 cogs sailed in the night, said Mace, pouncing on his moment and missing it. "Grain hams, cured fish. The reach shall keep the people fed, your grace. And, if I may, oh, a small flourish does not hurt. Our bakers will distribute loaves along the street of flour at midday, each stamped with the rose of Highgarden. We must show the people who—" "You will stamp them with the crown," said Circe, and smiled. "A rose may have thorns, Lord Tyrell, but it grows in royal gardens." Mace recovered, beamed, prepared to agree even with the sky. "But of course, the crown." The rose intertwined. "Only the crown," Circe said. "We will not confuse the hungry." Kevin's eyes flickered in what might almost have been amusement, but he said nothing. He has learned where the edges are, she thought with a twist of pity. She wondered when he would leave again, when duty would outweigh his dislike of her. The Iron Bank writes again. Picel creaked, producing a letter like a magician pulling a dove from his sleeve. They reiterate their concern regarding repayments. Their tone is firm. "The crown's debts are the crown's concern," Circe said. "We have weathered sterner storms than paper." Qyburn's mild eyes were the color of shadows. "Paper can be tinder," he said, gentle as if offering a blanket. "With the Queen's permission, I have also made inquiries among certain lenders here in the city. There is gold to be had, but at a price." "There is always a price," she murmured. She did not look at Kevin, who had his father's habit of looking at problems as if they were sums to be put straight. "We will not rush to sell the crown's virtue to moneylenders. Speak to the master of coin," she said for the pleasure of watching Mace startle. "Find what you can without embarrassing us." "I shall handle it," Mace said, remembering belatedly to puff himself. "I have great rapport with the Iron Bank. I took a troupe of singers." "We all remember," Circe said. "There were other matters. There were always other matters. A dispute over tin, a border squabble, a petition for clemency that bored her into cruelty. The morning crawled and concluded. When at last she rose, she felt the fatigue in her bones as a kind of righteous weight. Outside, the sunlight was stronger. The gardens of the Red Keep were noisy with bees. Marguerite Tyrell stood under the pergola of the Ladies' Garden, where the grapevines threw patches of shade like lace. Girls trailed her, cousins and handmaids and the city's daughters who had made themselves satellites in her orbit. She had a basket on one arm. The basket held loaves wrapped in linen, still warm, their flanks stamped with a crown so crisp it could cut a finger. She gave them away with that expression she had perfected, the kind that said she was happy to be of service to the world. The bread moved from her to rough hands and tears. "Your Grace," she said when Circe approached. The courtesies were smooth, the eyes behind them bright. "We thought to bring a little comfort to the keep while the city eats. Would you care for a piece?" "I am not hungry," Circe said. "Oh, but you must eat," Marjorie said lightly, as if to a child. "You'll waste away." Circe looked at the girl's face and saw the steel. "You will see the king for the noontide meal." "If he is ready," Marjorie said, all deference. Then, as if thinking of nothing at all, "The High Septon sends his blessings by the by. He seems very content with the arrangements for the coronation feast." "I am pleased that he is pleased," Circe said. "His Holiness has always understood the proper place of the faith." Marguerite laid a loaf into a beggar woman's hands and let her fingers linger there an instant longer. "Places can change, I find," she said softly. Then she smiled in that disarming way, and the danger passed like a fish under a boat. In the sept itself, the High Septon sat in a steaming copper tub, while a boy with careful fingers poured oil through his hair. He could hear the city's faint roar the way one hears the sea through a shell. It comforted him. He had been taught to love the Seven with that slow, credulous love that takes hold in men who find their appetites and their piety do not trouble each other's sleep. The world was simpler when the faithful were content and the hungry were fed. He had received a petition months ago from a ragged cluster of zealots who had wanted him to gather the poor into an army of God. He had read it twice. He had placed it under a candle. He had forgotten it. It was too hot to think of rearming men with old vows. Swords made one sweat. The city's underside stirred regardless. In alleyways where gutters were green with their own life, men whispered of the rose loaves and who stamped them. Of the queen who was a lioness. Of the queen who was a flower. Whispers had weight because food had weight. A woman with flour on her arm said, "The flower smiles." And a man at her elbow said, "The lion bites." Varys would have liked those whispers, but Varys had left the city with Tyrion in a crate, and the echo of a crossbow's twang still rattling in the tunnels. His little birds remained like seeds in the cracks. Qyburn had coaxed a few to sing in a different register. They brought him scraps. A cook with grease in his eyelashes reported that Sir Loras Tyrell still went to whisper at his queen sister's door late at night and laughed too loudly in the mornings. A washerwoman with red hands reported Tommen's habit of sleeping with his face under the sheet when it thundered. A scribe whose fingers were stained with berry ink brought a list of those merchants who had wrung gold from other men's fear in the sacking of the city. It was not much, yet it was something. Qyburn would sit with what he learned and stroke it into shape. In his cellars, he kept things that ought not to keep. There was a smell down there of oils and old flowers turned to rot. There were the mutterings of men who could not tell if they still had voices. If a queen asked him for an impossible thing, he would nod and go downstairs. He went downstairs often. The river lanes were bruised and bandaged, and the Vale sat clean as a saint on its mountain in the blue. Pettier Baelish rode a patient mare along a track that gave him a piece of sky at each turn. The boy lord chattered, alert and anxious, while Pettier answered with the unthreatening charm he wore like a cloak. Elaine Stone, Sansa Stark in a new skin, rode behind him with her hands buried in her cloak and her eyes studying the land as if it would tell her what to become. He had planned storms. He believed in them as other men believed in gods. But one of his better storms had not come. He had not been able to coax the city's holy hunger into a blade. He had laid small fires in alleyways and sent whispers into beards, and nothing had gone up. The High Septon remained a melon with jewels around its neck. Pettier did not mind. When one gust did not fill a sail, another would. He had a different thought already, feather light, about brothers and bedding and who should be made to blush. Gossip could be a lever where soldiers could not. He took out his thought and turned it, and carefully put it away again. In the north, wind moved like a thing with a mind. At Castle Black, Jon Snow stood on the wall, as if the cold were part of his skin. It had bitten him so often the bite no longer surprised. The world spread out in its monotone, and the lines in it were wolves and men, and the tracks of both. Ravens had come and gone in the night. Stannis Baratheon's banners snapped below. Threadbare royal pride in the teeth of weather. The king had a plan that, like most plans in winter, suspected everything would be solved with a little more iron. Jon read one of the letters again. The crown seal was pressed cleanly. The handwriting was fine and a touch decorative. It said, in the manner of a man writing a list, that the king had wed Marjorie of House Tyrell, and that offerings were made in the sept, and that the city had eaten on the day after. Jon could see, in a blank part of his mind, the way sunlight would lie on golden hair, and the angle of a boy's head in a crowd. None of it had to do with the cold coming down the world. He spoke with Sam about stores. He walked the yard with his officers. He listened to the sound of training steel, and wondered which man with which rhythms would live longest when steel mattered. He did not sleep enough, and when he did, he dreamed of trees that moved without wind. Winterfell had stone that held the memory of fires. Ramsay Bolton had hung skins from hooks in rooms that had once held banners. He hummed beneath his breath as he crossed a courtyard where snow had not yet taken hold, delighted by the small resistance of frost under heel. His father's gaze was measured carpentry. Ramsay preferred tools that sang. There were banners here now with a new emblem to remind men which names they were permitted to say. In the alehouses of Wintertown, men learned to pronounce warden without laughing. Sansa, Elaine, learned to cook mushrooms and play at laughter with the other girls at the Eyrie. Littlefinger taught her the mathematics of time. It's only dangerous if you arrive too early, he told her, as if speaking of a dance. Arrive too late, and everything has arranged itself without you." He spoke of the Vale's knights as if they were coins he might stack in towers, and he spoke lightly of the river lords who glowered like men whose harvest had been eaten. When she lay at night, with the cold of the mountain throbbing in her ears, she told herself the names she could not say aloud. In King's Landing, the noon meal brought the king and his queen together in a chamber where the shadows of latticework made a net on the rugs. Tommen came with the soft step of a boy who knows he must not run. He kissed his mother's hand, and then kissed Margary's and blushed. The table smelled of roasted birds and herbs crushed under knives. Outside, the cry of hawkers, fresh fish, rose and fell. "I saw the kittens again," Tommen said to Margary, each word the beginning of excitement. "Did you?" Margary said, and her smile did not skip a beat. "What color were they today?" "Black as coal," he said, awed by the idea of color being reliable. They were playing with a piece of ribbon. Cersei placed a slice of meat on his plate. "You will attend to your lessons after," she said. "Sir Eris will test you on the lineage of the Kingsguard after the conquest." Margary's smile deepened by a modulation nearly invisible till one had learned to watch for it. "It will be easy, my love. The names are lovely. Hightower and Dane and Went, like lines in a song." "Da." Tommen brightened. "Will you hear me recite?" "Of course," she said. "I shall applaud like a court of 1,000. She glanced across the table to Cersei. "The High Septon sends word that the altars will be garlanded with white lilies for the next feast day. He thinks it becoming. The High Septon thinks anything becoming that includes satin ribbon," Cersei said, and sipped her wine. "We do not intend to make the city drunk with flowers, Lady Margaery. Bread matters more." "We agree on bread then," Margaery said. "How comforting." The windows admitted a slanted sun. Dust moved in it. A slow world. The cat not permitted at table slunk in regardless, and glanced at the lioness, and then at the rose, and chose to twine against a boy's legs. Tommen bent to scratch, and his laughter was a small fire. By afternoon, the street of flour was a river of people moving toward the carts. The loaves with their crisp crowns left the baskets and went into hands and mouths. Children ran with heels of bread, as if carrying trophies they might never finish. A blind man sat with his back to a wall and nibbled the hard edges. A girl with milk teeth stuck a piece in her mouth and sucked it soft. The word on the street, flour or lion, meant less than the word bread, and the crown stamped on dough became in that hour part of the city's body, like the sound of gulls or the smell of tallow. In the Red Keep, Jaime Lannister stood in a practice yard, where the flags above made rectangles of shade. He held a wooden sword in his left hand and watched the way the practice master's eyes gave him no quarter. He had learned how to move the weight. The thing he could not master was the absence in his right. It itched sometimes like a thought that would not come. Bronn had once told him to learn to fight dirty and die clean. He practiced until the sweat in his hair ran salt into his eyes. When he lowered the sword, he saw his sister on a balcony, not watching him. He felt a complicated ache, the kind that came with names. His father's ghost sat under everything in the keep, like a foundation stone someone had forgotten to build around. Nothing rattled without it. He found Cersei later by a window. She was no longer a girl he could read like a map. "There are letters from Dorne," he said without preface. "They write purple. They always have," she said. "Do they still threaten war in the same sentences where they invite us to feast?" "More or less." He smiled with half his mouth. "We should fetch Myrcella. We should do many things," she said, sounding as tired as a blade used to scrape grease. "You will go." He understood what she wanted him to understand. Dorne had a coiled patience. The Red Viper had died. His lover did not forget. Bringing Myrcella home would untie a knot in Cersei's heart. "I'll need men I can trust," he said. "You do not trust our men." "I trust them to be bought," he said easily. "All men can be bought. Some are priced too high for the market. Take whom you will," she said, and looked at him in that way that made him feel naked and grim. Unhelpful ways. "Do not fail me, Jaime. The last word had all the sharpness of an old promise. Olenna Tyrell returned to King's Landing as if arriving at a house where the servants had rearranged the furniture. She came with bustle and a mild thunder of commentary. She inspected her granddaughter with pinching fingers and her enemies with a narrowed gaze. She approved of the bread loaves and disliked the stamps. She greeted the High Septon and thought him a pudding. And the Queen Regent? She asked Marguerite in a bower where the air moved, and a tray of sugared pears sat, as if for a story painted on porcelain. Very much herself, Marguerite said. Olenna said and ate a pear. Men are fools, and gods are worse. But women can make a kind of weather, if they time their clouds. She tapped the table lightly. We shall be pleasant until we are not. Loris laughed with a recklessness meant to sound like youth and sounded to Olenna like a dog whistling in a graveyard. He sparred more than necessary. He came back with the bloom high in his cheek and the compliments of men trailing him like leaves. His sister saw him when he thought no one saw him and pressed his hand and said nothing aloud. If the city had arched its back and bared its teeth, if steel had found scripture, Loris would have been caught between those jaws. As it was, the law still preferred to watch what it did not understand and be disgusted in private. The risk was more subtle. Subtle risks went unheard until the moment of the snap. Evenings in the Red Keep took on a sweet veneer. There were dinners where singers told old songs with new pauses. There were games with cups and little balls and small bits of gold. Tommen's laughter made certain men tender. There was a night when Mace Tyrell insisted on dancing and stamped on silk. There was a night when Kevin looked at Cersei across a table and thought of his brother and did not know which memory to choose. One such evening, while candles bled, Littlefinger came to present himself as a man too humble to be noticed. He bowed the right amount. He had a gift wrapped in nothing. A plan, folded so small it looked like a rumor. The city speaks in two tunes, he remarked later to Qyburn, because some men's doors were worth tapping lightly. A song of bread and a song of envy. With the right accompaniment, one can make a harmony that breaks glass. Qyburn turned a page in his book and smiled. Do you like opera, Lord Baelish? I like endings, Littlefinger said. And the applause. He did not stay. He did not have to. Seeds required soil and time. He had begun a whisper about a cousin touching a cousin, about a marriage contract signed too quickly. He had given a sliver of former gold cloaks, a private wage to forget to intervene in a tavern dispute that would end with a name spoken too loudly. Soon, men would be laughing about Loris again, not because they cared whom he loved, but because laughter could be steered. The city cooled after sunset like a bread oven with the door cracked. The sept took on a melancholy glow. The High Septon droned, and the faithful dozed. In an antechamber behind the main nave, a thin priest counted coins with an intensity that would have looked like prayer to anyone just inside the doorway. He was balancing the gift of a reeve against the promise of a merchant whose wife wanted an annulment. The thin priest had once been a boy in a village that flooded every spring. He liked numbers because they did not change their minds. Cersei walked through the corridors and smelled beeswax and the ghost of roses. If the faith had been a weapon, she would have used it by now. She knew herself well enough to know what she would do to win. She did not have that blade. She would use others. She had the city watch. She had the loyalty of men who liked their pay on time. She had the man downstairs who could make a corpse remember its duty. She had her son's smile, which she would turn into whatever the world required. Her father once said that men were pieces on a board until you taught them to be something else. She thought of Tywin and felt herself harden. Then she thought of Tommen's hand on a cat's head and felt a softening so violent she wanted to tear her own heart out and show it to herself. She sent for the captain of the watch. She sent for a scribe. She walked out onto a balcony and let the air cool the hot place in her head. On the morrow, Marguerite went riding with the ladies at the edge of the city. Guards in green trailing and keeping their distance because their queen's laughter seemed to require the illusion of freedom. A field of thistles lay like a soft sea, their heads purple. Marguerite's horse took the ground like water. She could see the sept in its pallor. the keep with its stubborn geometry, and thought of how light fell on both differently and what that meant. Her grandmother's words had put hooks in her mind. She felt the pull. She did not love games for their own sake. She loved winning because it meant she had moved through the world without being pushed. In a stand of willows near the water, she found a boy fishing with a string for a line and a thorn for a hook. She asked his name and he, dazzled and terrified, could not remember. She taught him how to tie a different knot with fingers that were more used to ribbons. When she gave him half a loaf from her saddlebag, he bit it with reverence and swore he would share with his sister. She believed him because she wanted to. She rode back, thinking, bread, 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 like a drumbeat. Later, when she sat alone, she wrote a letter to the gardeners at Highgarden about planting mint and roses in poor soil, and how sometimes the mint would take first and make enough scent for the rest. In the port, men unloaded amphorae and cut their hands on pottery. They cursed the reach in a way that was almost a hymn. One of them, a lank man with eyes like wet slate, listened to a tanner talk about the Queen's new tax on hides and thought of his brother who had died on the Blackwater, and thought of a time when meat had been cheaper because there had been more men to eat it. He spat and felt better. Nights threw up other stories. In a brothel near the Street of Silk, a young man with a handsome mouth and a scar that made his cheek interesting kissed another man with such ferocity, he forgot there was a door that could open. The wrong eyes saw. Purse changed hands. A word moved down a narrow street. Laughing is a way of pointing. The next day, 2 boys at the practice yard aimed jibes at a knight who blazed too bright, and one of them lost a tooth for his trouble. Behind the laughter, a blade was being sharpened. Littlefinger could hear the whisper of steel on stone. In a room that had once held a small council of a different sort, Olenna and Kevin met, as if by accident. The air between them was composed of old battlefields. "You would do better to keep your banners in the closets," Kevin murmured, as if talking about weather. "And you would do better to teach your niece to see beyond her own face," Olenna said. "We have much to discuss." They did not agree on much. They agreed on this. The city was a bowl that would not bear being filled while men fought over who held the ladle. The faith, left to its oils and its candles, would not trouble them. That suited Kevin, who liked his problems to be tangible, and Olenna, who preferred them to be chosen. Jamie departed under a sky as pale as a peeled almond. He took with him a handful of men who did not sing, and Bronn, because a man who laughed at the right moment could be a shield. Cersei watched him go from a window and did not wave. She allowed herself exactly one breath of grief, and then shut the window and sent for the captain of the watch again. In the north, Stannis moved like a black dot across a white page. His men cursed quietly and then loudly. They ate themselves out of patience. He had sent letters to men whose banners had been burned and asked them to imagine them unburned. Jon Snow counted barrels of salt beef and looked south and did not envy men their crowns. In the Vale, a falcon turned in the air as if studying its own flight. Elaine woke with frost on the window and practiced saying, "Good morning," and "Yes, my lord," and "No, I haven't seen him," until each phrase could mean 10 different things. Littlefinger laid out his markers. The Vale's harvest late and liable to spoil if not moved. The Riverland's stubbornness arranged like stones across a path. The capital with its 2 queens. "We will come down like snow melt," he said softly. Quiet at first, and then suddenly everything moves. In King's Landing, the afternoon light made the dust seem to rise from the floors. Tommen recited names and dates, and when he faltered, Margaery's fingers flexed as if she could carry the last syllable for him. Loras stood in the doorway and watched. Cersei arranged a feast and invited those men who could be trusted to laugh at the right jests. Qyburn perfected a salve for burns that would not heal, and ran his hand with care over a shape beneath a linen. The High Septon ate sugared apricots and blessed them with an honest heart. The small folk spoke of the crown loaves as if they were a season. Some hoarded crusts to dry and grate into soups. Some threw peels to the every-colored pigs that ran down the alleys with more dignity than men. The city watch grew a little fatter on their pay, which arrived on time for once. Two gold cloaks argued in a doorway about whether the queen's hair was really gold or just a trick of light. A third told them to shut their arses and watch the street. A summer storm rolled in from the east, brief, hot, water falling in sudden sheets as if too much had been held back too long. It drummed on the tiles of the sept and the keep and beat petals from the roses. Marguerite and Tommen looked out a window and counted heartbeats between lightning and thunder. Tommen's cat hid under a chair. Cersei stood with her hands on the sill and watched the rain cut the city into segments. She imagined, as she often did in weather, that the world could be washed to a new condition. When the storm passed, everything smelled new and the same. In the storm's wake, laughter found a softer target. A song made its way through taverns, a little rhyme about a knight of flowers who liked blossoms of his own planting. It had a sweet tune. Men with poor ears could carry it. Most sang without malice. A few sang to wound. Loras heard it once from the shadows and saw, as through a glass, the path a song could cut when nothing stopped it. He squared his shoulders and rode with the king's guard in the morning, like a man going to a well to prove water would not wet him. Cersei heard the song too. She did not start it, but she did not stop it. She watched Marguerite's face as if to see where the bruise would bloom. She understood timing better than she understood mercy. If the faith had risen like a curtain, the drama would have been simpler. This was the old game, the one without rules, where a smile could be a blade. It suited her temper. She sent a whisperer to a tailor who had once measured robes for the High Septon and knew with his fingers how much a man could be wrapped. She sent a different whisperer to a woman who had sewn gowns for brothels of different prices and knew which girl could be bought for which arrangement and whether she would talk afterward. She did not intend to lean on the faith. She intended to use the old idols, shame and appetite and the way walls have ears, until men fell to their knees for different reasons. At night in the Red Keep, the candles lowered themselves. A moth died in a pool of wax. Tommen dreamed of cats and woke smiling. Marguerite lay awake for an hour listening to the breath of the women in the antechamber and the distant footfall of a watch passing, and she thought about herbs that thrive in poor soil and what they taste like. Cersei listened to the sound of the city, the endless low tide of it, and tried to hear in it the footfall of her father. When she could not, she slept in a sudden heavy drop, like a blade being put down on a table. Above the city, the stars came out with their indifferent arithmetic. The sept, white in daylight, was milk blue under them. In its nave, the last faithful muttered and went home. Somewhere deep in its belly, a thin priest tucked away the last coin and said a prayer that was half habit and half hope. There would be bread tomorrow. There would be laughter tomorrow. There would be the same beginnings. And the city would move a little, to a new place that felt like the old one. And everyone would pretend not to notice how the pattern had shifted, because pretending was part of the way things held. Weeks braided themselves. Jaime crossed borders and learned again how much a road can teach a man who must live with both his names. Letters arrived in King's Landing stamped with suns and spears. Cersei wrote replies with an economy of words that would have pleased Tywin if Tywin had ever been pleased by anything. Littlefinger moved a cup here and a cup there, and told a different boy a different story each time. The song about the Knight of Flowers acquired new stanzas, as songs will. Loras won a tilt and did not smile as he should have. Marguerite kissed Tommen's hair where it met his ear, and told him that a man was not a list he knew by heart, but a kindness he remembered to do without being asked, on a day like any other that would later be called a day when things turned. A fight broke out near the Street of Silk, between two men who had drunk past the point where truth could be held in the mouth without dribbling. One called the other a liar's lover. The other called the first a bastard knight. Steel came out as if drawn by the word. Steel. A boy ran to fetch the watch, and the watch came with the sluggish speed of men who had not been paid to move faster. By the time they arrived, the man with the handsome scar lay bleeding across his own knee, and the man who had insulted him had lost 2 fingers and was weeping. The crowd had already composed a moral. The watch gathered them up. The wrong person saw. That night, a name was written down and placed under a cup and moved. Littlefinger. hearing of it, thought, "And here is my breeze," and pursed his lips gently and blew. Circe let the news come to her as if surprised by it. She made 2 calculations, one about how many loaves would be distributed next week, one about how soon a mother would weep if the wrong son were arrested. She sent Quiburn to speak to a captain she knew to be amenable to kisses of coin, and she had a letter written to Olenna in such honeyed terms the paper almost stuck to the table. Olenna read it and scowled, and held it to the light as if it might confess. "You could have stopped this," she said to Marguerite. "Could I?" Marguerite asked. The question was honest. There are moments when a river that looks slow and domesticated discovers all at once that it still has a mountain in it. The High Septon ate a peach with eyes closed and blessed its juice. Someone spoke, carefully, about the incident on the Street of Silk, and whether the faith could counsel moderation. He nodded and asked for another peach. The faithful knelt and rose. Their knees hurt from a lifetime of devotions. They went to their homes and slept. No one dreamed of swords laid in the laps of statues. No one looked for zeal with a lantern. At dawn again, the sept's bells hesitated and then rang, and the city inhaled the smell of bread. The light came, weak at first, and then, as if remembering itself, stronger. Pigeons wrestled for crumbs. On the balcony, Circe raised her cup and did not drink. The day stood ahead, thick with politics like a storm with air. Somewhere below, a boy with a string and a thorn tried his luck at the river and felt, at last, a serious pull. He leaned back, grinning to himself, and thought that this was what he had been waiting for, though he could not have said what it was. In the Red Keep, Tommen laughed at something his cat did, and in a small room low in the keep, a shape under linen took a breath that was not quite a breath, and did not belong to anyone yet, not even to death. The city moved again, a fraction of an inch, almost nothing, and yet everything that had been stacked so carefully adjusted itself in response. A loaf cracked along a seam and was still good to eat. A rumor cut a new channel through the soft rock of the crowd. The rosebush in the Queen's garden put out a bud that would open tomorrow at noon, perfect for 1 hour, and then begin to fall apart petal by petal to show where the sweetness had been. The fight on the Street of Silk cracked open a membrane that had kept certain subjects soft. By week's end, men who had sung the song about the Night of Flowers now sang it with a crueler lilt, and those who had not sung at all looked down when the refrain came and mouthed it in their cups. Circe allowed the current to run until it had scoured what she wished, then stepped where the stones were slickest and made herself look like a woman trying to keep balance for the sake of her son. She sent for Lord Mace. He filled the council chamber like a balestra full of fruit. His banners had brought a season into the city, but seasons pass, and even the Reach must be reminded what weather is made by crowns. He came carrying reports. Repairs to the Roserad, the price of saffron at dockside, a letter praising his judgment from some lordling whose praise had once been coin. She let him talk until he grew comfortable, then took the cushion from under him. "Dragonstone," she said, and her tone made the word a stone set carefully on a scale. "Dragonstone," he repeated, already smiling. "Ah, I have a mind to see the red keeplings scoured out. Stannis embers remain there, paltry. A gust would do. I was thinking of laying a siege as a lesson." "Lessons are long," Circe said. "Children grow tired. I would prefer a demonstration." "Demonstrations, yes," he puffed. "I once saw a sand sculptor in Old Town who could—" "Sir Loras will take Dragonstone," she said, and held his gaze the way a falconer holds the jess of a bird about to leap. A night of flowers turning to thorns at last. Swift, clean, exemplary. Macy's mouth did a small, involuntary thing. The word exemplary had claws in it. Sir Loras, he managed, rallying, would bring honor to the task, naturally. He is gadless steel, your grace. He is—" "Expedite it," Circe said. "Let the city see how quickly trouble is pruned when competent hands hold the shears." Pycelle, who had been pretending to be a tapestry, made a sympathetic sound that could have been a sigh or wind caught in curtains. Kevin watched his hands. Qyburn studied the motes in a bar of light, as if they were snow. Mace assured them all that timetables were nothing to a Tyrell when honor was at stake, and left to tell his son he was fortunate. After, alone, he leaned his considerable body against a pillar in a corridor, and breathed, as if the air were a thing he had to eat. Olenna found him like that, and clucked her tongue. "She sends the boy to smoke," the Queen of Thorns said, as if remarking on a stain in a fine tablecloth. "You will thank her for it, and she will enjoy your gratitude." "He is Loras," Mace said, half pleading, half proud, all-father. "He has been unhorsed once in 36 tilts." "He? Tilts are roses. Stone keeps are nettles," Olenna said briskly. "Write the boy this minute. If he must go as if walking into a kitchen fire with a wet cloth, not as if dancing. And Mace, if he is burned, do not allow her the story." "No wonder." "What story?" "That we sent him," she said. "Make them remember that she ordered him, and that he obeyed for love of the realm. It is garnish, but garnish is what men taste when they have swallowed meat they did not choose." Loras, when told, took the news with the composure of a man who had been expecting a blade, and was relieved to see it was one he knew the balance of. He kissed his sister's brow and let his hand rest half a beat longer in hers than custom required. He did not go to the Street of Silk to find the man with the handsome scar. He laughed with his fellows in the yard until the laugh became a kind of armor. At dawn the day he rode for the bay, he walked alone once around the inner ward, tracing the route boys took when they dared themselves near the great throne, and said nothing aloud. Marguerite, that same dawn, stepped out into the garden's shadow and breathed the green. Tommen joined her with a gravity that would have been comic in an older man. In him it had the sudden poignancy of childhood practicing its future. He took her hand and told her he had dreamed he was on a horse that knew the way home without being told. "Most good horses do," she said. "The trick is to know when to let them." "Sir Loras' horse knows the way," Tommen said, his eyes large with belief. "It does," she agreed, and smiled at him for the boy he was. Later, away from him, she paced the length of her chamber twice and then wrote 2 letters. One to Highgarden about herbs that thrive in ash. Another to a woman she knew in Old Town who had a way with quieting gossip with better gossip. Bread was not enough when stories were the air men breathed. The harbor was a mirror scribbled on by oars. Loras's galleys cut it to pieces and stitched it again in their wake. The red basalt isle crouched beyond like an old animal that had learned its own weight. Dragonstone's towers were knives. Its walls were an old dragon's ribbed belly. Inside were men who had sworn to stone more than to a king. Men who had eaten salt and rain through a winter and called it victory. Loras watched the approach without speaking, the habit of prayer pressing against his tongue like the taste of iron. When the first stones from his engines struck and sang, he felt something in himself set and would not be moved. Cersei made the city watch the horizon and remember who had coordinated the embroidery. She ordered loaves stamped with the crown again, but this time with a small row of dots beneath. "Bread for luck," the superstition whispered. She went to the sept to be seen assessing lilies in a vase for tomorrows, and the high septon, perspiring significantly, promised her his prayers as if prayers were bolts of gray cloth to be measured out and sent to tailors. She stood quietly and looked at the graven faces of the 7. She saw in them the chisel marks and the way the stones still remembered the hand that had carved it. She did not see mercy. When she left, she smelled lilacs and moss and the faint, persistent sweetness of apricot. At council, she played the lattice game. "Lord Tyrell," she said smoothly, "I am heartened to hear how swiftly Dragonstone yields to valor. The city will be safer by week's end. Perhaps then we might address the matter of those outstanding notes to the Iron Bank. The crown loaves are not owed on credit." "Then so." "Notes," Mace said, rolling the word around in his mouth like a cherry stone. "Notes are wind. Bread is." Wheat, Kevin supplied, dry as a ledger. Which must be bought. I have a list. Lists, Mace said, half offended at the very concept. I have everything in hand. Keep it there, Cersei said. I dislike seeing the crown in other men's fingers. Qyburn regarded the queen with a fondness only he recognized as fondness. He had done what she required. In the low room, whose windows were not windows, where candles failed to throw shadows, something vast and armorial had learned again the notion of balance. It would walk when told to walk. He wrote on a scrap of kid hide and dried it over a flame, and when the letters tightened, he smiled. Men who feared the gods would call it sorcery. Men who feared other men would call it medicine. He called it a solution. He asked for an audience and took in a bundle the size of a man's helmet, wrapped in linen. When Cersei waved the chamber clean of attendants, he unwound the cloth. Inside lay a mask, plain iron, face-shaped, made done with a wash that would not gleam. He lifted it like a priest lifts a relic. "Ace for a vow," he said. "A vow for a face," she murmured, intrigued despite herself. "You are certain he will never speak?" "As certain as anyone can be of death," Qyburn said pleasantly. "Which is to say, entirely, until the moment one is not." "Good," she said, and took the iron in her hands. Felt its weight. "I am tired of conversation." She brought the matter to the White Sword Tower where the Kingsguard wrote their names and believed in white pages as if they were absolution. Balon Swan kept his face still in that disarming way some handsome men learn to seem kinder than circumstance. Boris Blount looked as if he had eaten something that disagreed with him 3 years ago. Trant blinked at the world like a man for whom thinking was a damp log. Osmond Kettleblack smirked. Loras's chair remained empty and would remain so until his return, or until a scribe ruled a fine line through his name and wrote elegies in small script at the bottom of the page. "Tommen will have a strong protector while his good brother makes the realms safer," Cersei said. "Sir Robert Strong." "Strong?" Balon repeated politely. "I do not know the name." "You do," she said. "He has no tongue for gossip." The man who followed wore the iron face. He moved with that terrible patience of men who have rehearsed each motion until their bodies obey like a drilled company. When he took a knee, the room changed temperature. Boros Blount, who had sweated through battles and deserts, had the disconcerting impression of winter pressing its hands against the back of his neck. Meryn Trant rubbed his jaw and made a low sound that could have meant nothing. Even Balon, competent and sensitive to winds, studied the shape that hid itself under the plate and did not pretend he was at ease. Cersei watched the men watch the mask. Watching is information. She saw the precise degree to which fear sweetens loyalty. She allowed herself, in the space of 2 heartbeats, to imagine what it would be to set this giant against a man who offended her. Then she tucked the thought away with the economy her father would have approved. "Write his name," she said, and the white book, which was meant to resist ink as stone resists rain, took the letters and swallowed them. Olenna saw the new appointment from the corner of her eye and busied herself with fruit, so that no one would read the chalk of her expression. Giants, masked, songs, sharpened, a boy being sent to Ash. She sat with Marguerite at a table and broke a pomegranate into its rubies, with fingers quick as a sewing woman's, and listened to her granddaughter say that bread is still bread when given by a hand that offends you. "Yes," Olenna said, and then added, "but the mouth never forgets." Loras's siege worked like a theory until the moment it didn't. The garrison had learned by watching sky and sea. The gates would not open for bravado. Fire found lines it should not have found. Wind changed its mind. Loras rode to the gate with a shield high and a shout in his throat, and the shout became smoke. Later, a man who had been in the yard said he saw a flower burn and did not know it was possible. Even later, when he told it again, he said the flower did not burn. It was turned to black glass, and therefore would last forever in another form. Stories make reliquaries out of skin. Word came in stages. First, a rumor that he had fallen. Then, a counter-rumor that he had leapt from a wall like a stag, and landed in a boat, and rowed with one arm while fighting off 10 men with the other. Then letters. He had been grievously wounded and would be tended by the leeches and the milk of the poppy and gods old and new. Mace went pale in a place his face had forgotten how to be pale and made noises like a blown skin. Olenna received the news as if it were a piece of honeycomb, and she had expected both sweetness and sting. Cersei had ordered the city to watch. Now she told the city what it had watched. She declared a day of prayers for the brave. The High Septon intoned with renewed energy. The lilies doubled. The altars kept their clean scent, and the candle smoke curled script no one could read. People in the street said, "He is brave, and he is vain, and he is ours, and he is theirs," and each meant something slightly different when they used the pronouns. Margaery went to the royal menagerie with Tommen and stood long watching the doves. Their heads bobbed at the grain with comic seriousness. "He will live," she said, and let the sentence sit between them till even the boy felt the weight on the end. "He is too proud to let me weep so long. He will rise to spite me." Tommen took her hand and said, earnest beyond his years, "The 7 will hear us," and she squeezed back as if confirmation alone could teach gods their duty. That night, Littlefinger attended a supper at which he said almost nothing, and learned, in return for his silence, 3 small things, which Goldcloak had delayed his men that morning to speak to a whore who had returned to the city with a new baby, which seamstress had been paid to add a half-inch to the High Septon's girth with her needlework, and had not, yet, and which singer had first given the song its cruel lilt and could be induced to soften. He went home and wrote a letter with ink. He warmed over a candle so that it would flow like confession. He sent a purse with an apology. He set a line of men who would look away at a specific gate at a specific hour next week, and slept with the contentment of a man who had gathered enough threads for tomorrow's braid. Jaime's road south went first through country that knew him as a picture on a deck of cards. He wore plain gear. He wrapped the gold of his hair. He had Bronn beside him because Bronn's view of the world was like cold water on tired feet. "Dorn," Bronn said with relish, as if tasting a word. "Warmed wine, and knives in your back from women who smile while they do it. I've always had a fondness." "You would," Jaime said. "You like your enemies honest and your friends entertaining." "I like them profitable," Bronn said cheerfully. "You should try it." They crossed into a land that tasted of salt and sun. The sky lowered itself like a lid. The water gardens shimmered the way a promise does when you do not yet know what part of it is true. Ariohota met them with the courtesy of a man who could snap a man's life like a twig, and believed the twig was not his to snap without order. He examined Jaime's hand the way a master examines a tool, and made no change to his face. "Prince Doran awaits," he said. Doran Martell sat with his foot in a bath, and the other on a stool, and looked like a man who had listened for so long he had learned to measure more precisely than the world deserved. He welcomed Jaime with the words with which one welcomes men one has wanted to see and not wanted to see, and had decided could not be avoided. "You come for the princess," Doran said. "I come for my daughter," Jaime replied, and felt the truth of it in a place he did not name in language even to himself. "You will see her," Doran said, and gestured to the sunlight as if it were a cousin. "She is happy here, in the way a girl who knows she was made a piece can be happy by forgetting the board." He brought them to Myrcella. She had outgrown the last image Jaime carried of her by steps, so delicate memory had not noticed. She stood straight. She had a way of looking at men that suggested she had learned there are answers one can choose to give or not to give. A pale arc marked where a blade had kissed her ear in another man's plot. She smiled, and it was like a small fire in winter, stubborn and valuable. "Uncle," she said, because there were walls. "Daughter," he said, because the word came unbidden and called his face into a different shape. Doran watched them with the sadness of a man who had been a father in several ways and been denied in several more. "I will not spill blood to satisfy your sister's temper," he said later. Once the niceties had finished and the oranges had been sweet and the fountain had done its soothing. Nor will I send off a girl whose presence here holds men in check, not while the sea is full of snakes with our colors tied to their tails. But I will discuss terms. Take your ease. Listen to the water. Tell me something true in return for something true. Jamie told a story about a king who had been cruel, and a boy who had been beautiful, and a man who had been sent to kill his king for cruelty, and had done it, and had been called cruel forever after. Doran told a story about a sister who had laughed like sun-struck water, and had been broken, and how a brother had learned to sit very still and wait. They both understood the essential thing. That what mattered was not the stories men told so much as when they told them and to whom. Bronn, in an inner court, taught a Dornish boy a Westerland's curse, and learned 3 Dornish ones in return he liked better. Arianne Martell watched from an upper loggia, hair like a dark spill, eyes heavy with the knowledge that the world was a palace with doors locked to girls who waited at the correct doors. She eyed the Kingslayer as if measuring his use in a hinge. He felt the glance without looking up and filed it like a man keeps a map of a coastline he might yet sail. The sand snake seethed beautifully. To each, Jamie had a different face. To Abara, a man she wanted to beat. To Nymeria, a man she wanted to outtalk. To Tyene, a man she wanted to lead into a chapel and see if his vows squeaked under his armor. He took the measure of their fury and tried not to imagine what his sister would make of each when she was done. He found himself speaking to Ario more than to anyone else, because the big man's quiet was the kind that lets a tired man situate his bones. Letters went from Dorne to the capital. From the capital to Dorne. The Raven Master at the Red Keep ran a finger along a feather and thought of black skies. Cersei read Doran's, measured words, and tasted sawdust. He offered a season, not an answer. He required time. Time is a thing queens never think they have. She wrote back with a courtesy that tasted like iron, and sent a second, secret letter to a man in Planky Town whom Littlefinger had once paid to look after ships that went missing. 2 nets can be cast at once. If both catch, one may be called diplomacy and the other fortune. At Castle Black, the wind remembered its duty and whipped banners until they were flags again, instead of frozen plaques. Jon Snow, by now the habit of command had settled around him with as much naturalness as his cloak, read a letter, crumpled it, smoothed it, forced himself to read it again. It was from the south and concerned nothing he could change. He had had many such lately. They were beginning to feel like pebbles thrown against a fortress wall by a child, irritating if you were standing in the wrong place, harmless otherwise. He walked the wall at dusk and found the peace the cold gave him. Ghost appeared and vanished with that predatory quiet that made him seem like a thought the world was about to finish, but never did. Stannis' men had a new rumor. The king would ride again. The Karstarks had blinked. The mountain paths would be passable for another month if you did not mind dying. Jon said nothing and made lists. He spoke to Dolorous Ed and did not smile, and Ed, who understood how to feed a weary man, was funny on purpose and failed in the comforting way friends fail and remain friends. He dreamed of weirwoods, of course, of red sap weeping with a sound like iron cooling in water. He woke with a single name on his tongue and did not say it aloud in the dark, because he had learned not to put certain things into air where they might take root. In the Vale, snow came early to crimp the edges of days. Elaine Stone's breath made small clouds as she read a list of attendees who would come for this feast or that audience. Harry the Heir, in Littlefinger's lists, glittered like a coin seen at the bottom of a fountain. A prize for the patient. She practiced the smile that made men proud to be kinder than they had intended. She practiced answering questions with questions that sounded like compliments. She unlearned silence and learned texture. In private, she wrote a letter she did not send, to a mother whose bones lay under a myth. The act of writing made her certain of the reality she could not yet speak into rooms. Littlefinger arranged a hunt and made it a lesson. Quiet is half of any trick, he told her, as hounds bayed and hawks watched the ice edge for stupid birds. Let a man think he knows you. Then, let him choose his error. Choose? She asked, chin tucked into her cloak. He will choose it, Petyr said with that smile that implied a secret you would be given, if only you proved yourself his student. Men prefer the mistakes they make themselves to the truths they receive from others. Your enemy's pride is a rope. Let him tie the knot. Back in King's Landing, funnels of smoke rose from potters' kilns and from a dockside where men were burning lice out of their bedding. Smells layered. The city always wore too much perfume. The High Septon suffered a stomach ailment that improved his prayers. A scribe turned apostle, spent an hour staring at a gash of light on the floor, and came away convinced of destiny. Marguerite's breadline grew more orderly, not less, as the weeks chilled. She set 3 of her girls to watch for men who took more than their share, and a 4th to quietly offer seconds to women who were obviously carrying for homes larger than their hands. When Tommen accompanied her once, the city gave him that tender look it gives boys who might end up monsters, but are not yet. He glowed with it. Cersei watched from a distance, with a face that could have been carved. Qyburn stood at her shoulder and murmured something that made her mouth turn the way a man's mouth turns when he bites something sour to keep from fainting. The singer with the crueler lilt received Littlefinger's chain and changed keys. The song did not vanish. Psalms never do. It mellowed. It acquired a verse about a queen's luminous hair and how it glowed in stormlight. Olenna snorted aloud when she heard it and tossed the singer a coin anyway. It pleased her to pay for lies she could count. The Riverlands sent their woes in bundles. A Frey came to the city to tell a funny story no one laughed at. The Blackfish held his keep with the stubbornness of old men who have learned to marry principle to petty endurance. He refused to meet negotiators who had sauces on their sleeves. Riverrun's reflection trembled in its water and did not fall in. Kevin, when asked, opined that the best solution was a good meal and the right words, but the meal had yet to be served, and the right words were being used up, saying the wrong things to the wrong men. Jaime's absence from the region mattered. The world notices when absence is shaped like a particular man. From Dorne at last, another letter. Prince Doran wrote that it was not convenient to send the princess immediately. The sea did what it wished in months like these. He would be ready when the crown was ready to show it. It could protect what it asked to possess. He offered Myrcella's hand in betrothal to Trystane, formally now, in an ink that still smelled faintly of orange peel. He suggested an exchange of envoys of significant rank. Jaime read the letter twice, saw the traps and also the bridges, and thought for a long while about mercy. He sent back his own words, and then went to sit by a fountain where children were splashing each other with the measured generosity of children taught not to waste water, and watched their play until his face felt like it belonged to him again. At Dragonstone, the garrison capitulated by inches. Men eat hope at first and it nourishes like meat. After a while it is lettuce. Loras lay in a room with smoke-licked walls, while a man with leech scars on his cheeks doled out poppy and prayers. He drifted and returned to himself, and drifted. Between one pain and the next, he saw his sister's face from that morning. Green light, birds, a boy's hand in hers, and used it like a rope. When at last the island's banner faltered, he was carried to a ship on a board. He insisted, through the soup of pain, that the board be one used as a shelf for herbs in the keep's kitchen. Later, a cook would tell it differently, but for the moment, it was merely a board that smelled of rosemary and ash. In the city, the bells rang, and men spoke of valor, and Cersei smiled in a way that told those who loved her that caution would be wise. Mace, swollen with grief and pride, tried to plant himself deeper in the keep. Cersei narrowed doors. The Queen of Thorns clipped a princess rose and found a grub. She preened the politics with the same practical intimacy, squashing here, tending there. When she went to the sept and saw the High Septon's new ring, a little larger, set with a stone the color of old honey, she shook her head. "We have been spared a storm," she told Margaery later, and allowed the girl to infer which storm that had been. "What storm?" Tommen asked, because he was present, and the world should not hide itself. "The kind that blows good hats into the river," Olenna said. "We like our hats." Cersei found at last a use for a smaller storm. She invited certain men to a supper where the dishes were arranged with foolish artistry, and between the soup and the fish she signaled to Qyburn. A page brought in a small servant's boy shaking with stage fright. The boy recited, in a monotone, a list of loans the Tyrells had made not to the crown, but to their own friends at ruinous rates, enumerated with a precision that made the numbers bite. He then tripped and spilled wine on Mace Tyrell's sleeve. Mace turned 2 shades of color and loudly forgave him. The room, relieved, laughed in the wrong places. Information often dresses itself in comedy before it plunges the knife. Olenna did not laugh. She watched Cersei the way a cat watches a bat, mildly curious until movement suggests a hunt. Later, in her solar, Cersei waved off Pycelle and kept Hubern. "And our friend in the Silk Street?" she asked. "A fickle reed, but one we have bent," he said. "He knows when to lower his eyes. With your leave, I will plant another reed in better soil." "Plant," she said. "We will need a bed of them if we are to walk dry-shod across the swamp of men's opinions." He bowed. "Your Grace has a gardener's patience. I have a mother's fear," she said, surprising herself. That fear ate into her nights, even as victory sharpened her days. Tommen's breath in sleep was a metronome she learned to keep time with. She did not pray. She stood sometimes at a window at an hour when the torches of the city looked like a map, and imagined lines drawn between dots, lines of influence and lineages and lines of hunger. She saw herself as the one who could direct the pen. She did not think, even in her most honest moments, of the pen writing her out. In Dorne, Jaime sat with Myrcella in a grove where the oranges had not yet sweetened, and told her about a city of green hills and riverlight, about what her mother had been like when all her anger was not yet true, about the sound of a raven wing in dawn. Myrcella listened with a gentle, unsparing attention. "I remember a little," she said. "I remember the smell of her gowns. I remember Joff's laugh before it changed." She touched the scar at her ear, as if to acknowledge a story that did not belong entirely to her. "I like it here," she admitted softly, and Jaime felt the soft shudder of 2 loyalties disagreeing. He did not know yet what he would do if Doran refused. He discovered, with a shock that felt like slipping on stairs and catching oneself 2 steps lower, that he did not want to spill blood in this place. He had seen enough blood to know which kinds refused to wash from sleep. He walked the galleries with Bronn, and they spoke of women and weapons, because men do, and then he lay alone, and watched the ceiling and thought of a boy in a wood, with a sword that was bigger than his hope, and a girl in a hall with a laugh like coins. The sand snakes tried again to tempt heat into motion. Doran turned like a man in whom wax had been poured and cooled in an iron mold. "Not yet," he told them. "Patience as savage as rage. The world is ripening. Take your hands off the fruit." Bemas. Back in the city, the Watch broke up another fight in the Silk Street. And this time, after, the captain took a knee crackling with old injuries, and told a boy who had thrown the first punch that if he wished to keep his teeth, he should choose better songs. "What songs?" the boy asked insolently. The captain smacked him kindly with the back of his hand and said, "Practice hymns. They have fewer knives in them." The High Septon preached a sermon about humility that might have been bracing if he had believed it. The faithful yawned and thanked him anyway. A thin priest counted coins and noticed a small deficit that meant a baker had been generous beyond his brief. He did nothing except note the name and intend to bring the man a prayer for his daughter, who had a cough. He forgot and remembered and forgot again. The cough settled into the girl like a squatter in a too large house, and then, abruptly, departed. The priest claimed the credit before the 7, and the baker believed him. Faith is efficient when it can claim both outcomes. Cersei hosted a tourney under the pretext of a saint's day with a name no one could quite remember. The stakes were modest, the spectacle was not. She wanted the city to sing something that wasn't a knife. She wanted them to see the Kingsguard glitter and forget how many detailed small men really kept a city quiet. She wanted Sir Robert Strong to ride, as if the future could take comfort from the sight of a man impossible in the ordinary catalogue of men. The field lay beyond the city walls where the smell of tanneries thinned. Banners made their own breeze. Tommen sat beaming, entranced by trumpets. Margaery pointed out the pennons and turned the explanations into a game. Olenna kept a lap rug and a tongue sharpened enough to cut bread. Kevin stood with his hands behind his back and counted the horses as if solving an old problem that might become new. Qyburn watched shadows and where they fell. Strom rode last. The field made a hush as he crossed it. He wore the iron face. The helm seemed an extension of it, not a cover. His horse took the ground as if it had sworn a vow too. Men who had eaten 3 breakfasts to steady themselves felt their stomachs empty as if a wheel had turned in them. He took his lance as if he were being polite to it and put it precisely where it must go. The opponent, an honorable nobody with a tidy name and a wife, who would keep his good doublet in a wooden chest clean to the end of her life, flew like a kite without a string and landed badly and would limp thereafter when it rained. The crowd roared, because crowds roar. Tommen leapt to his feet, thrilled in the way boys are thrilled when they see a giant lift a barrel. Marguerite clapped. Olenna did not. After, the lists ended in the thinning light. A juggler juggled torches, and a pickpocket lifted 2 purses, and a child slept on a wool cloak with the world's noise layered over him like another blanket. Cersei sat very straight, not smiling, a queen carved from the impulse to dominate. Strom stood behind her and did not breathe in any visible way. Men and women went home with talk in their mouths. "Did you see?" they began, and answered themselves yes and no, both true. That night, the singer with Littlefinger's chain tried a new song about giants wearing masks to hide their shame, and was silenced by a coin thrown with enough accuracy to split his lower lip. He changed again and sang instead about white cloaks and the pure cold of vows. The coin came from a hand that did not belong to Littlefinger, but would swear fealty to him when asked. Petty drank watered wine and watched the room quiet, and thought about the tourney he would hold in the Vale one day soon, when a girl was made a queen on a different board. Mace Tyrell sent ships to fetch his son from Dragonstone's sick house. The rumor said the boy was a shade of milk, and that his beauty had been chiseled down to something more ascetic. Rumor is a craftsman. It subdues faces it once exalted. Marguerite wrote every day and did not send most of the letters. She kept them folded under ribbon, and reread the ones she had not sent, and edited them in her head, and slept with her hand under her cheek, the way a girl sleeps who taught herself not to cry after the age of 9. Cersei's supremacy in the Red Keep felt so complete that she woke one morning, startled by the sight of a crack of hairline width in the plaster above her bed. It was nothing. It was a reminder. The world had not agreed to hold forever in any shape she preferred. She ate bread with honey and laughed when Pycelle misread a letter aloud and said the Iron Bank humbly insists, which was not the phrase they had used. She sent him away with a soft word and told Qyburn to write a reply that said something without promising anything, and whispered to him afterward that it was time to test a different kind of loyalty in a different man. "The Kettle Blacks," she said. "I tire of their smirks. They tire only of hunger," Qyburn said gently. "Feed them a different diet and they will purr." "Feed them what?" "Fear," he said, as if recommending a spice. She considered it, tilted her head the way a woman tilts her cup to judge the froth. "Not yet," she said. "But soon." By slow increments, the city bent toward winter. Fog found the river and curled like a cat's tail along the bank. The doves tucked their heads into their bodies and became balls of breathing feather. Marguerite told Tommen stories in the evenings about stoats and kings. She kneaded dough sometimes with her own hands with the women whose hands did it daily, and the women loved her for the humility and laughed at her kneading in their kitchens when her back was turned, as one laughs at a child who insists upon helping and makes more work. And love and laughter were both genuine. Cersei let the kitchens do what kitchens do, and planned the course of a meal 6 weeks hence that would pair the heart of a boar with a pear, roasted at the edge of its blackening. Qyburn made a note about a herb that would go well with it, if the boar happened to be a person. Jaime, in Dorne, at last received from Doran a promise phrased as a question. If a certain man not named could be brought to justice, if a certain legacy of broken bones could be addressed, then perhaps an arrangement might be made by which the young princess could visit her mother in safety, in exchange for 3 oaths. 3 oaths, Bronn said later, spitting an olive pit into a bush. He wants 3 because he knows you can't keep more than 2. I can keep one, Jamie said. Which one will keep the girl breathing? Probably the one that costs you the most, Bronn said, as if discussing the price of wine. Jamie found he could not hate Doran. He hated situations. He wrote a letter to Cersei that said less than it had to and sent a second, shorter one to Tommen that simply described the color of the water when light hits it at the hour just after noon. And Tommen held that letter like a secret lamp, and went to hold the cat, and did not know why he felt steadier when he did. Littlefinger wrote from the Eyrie that the snows would close the passes soon, that he proposed a series of minor tax adjustments that would, if announced with the correct philanthropic occasion, flow past the city's gullet, that he expected to bring fresh funds to the crown in the spring in exchange for a very minor alteration in the status of 3 Crown Lands manors, that he was looking forward to embracing his friends in the capital and paying his respects to the king, and that he had arranged for a... Cersei read the letter once, then twice. Then she put it to the candle, just long enough to make the edges turn brown, and smelled the fennel that had been used to thicken the ink, and smiled a smile no one in the room liked. Send him my gratitude, she said, and tell him I shall enjoy the scent of fennel. In the Vale, Elaine rehearsed saying, Lord Harry, in a tone that suggested neither adoration nor irony, and found, to her surprise, that she could make the syllables do as she wished. She sat with Petter at a window where Frost did fine needlework, and listened to plans handled with the monotone calm of a clerk counting money. Inside herself, she braided something that might one day hold weight, a resolve that did not require heat to set, a promise made to the girl whose name was not spoken, and to the lady she would need to be to keep faith with the dead and the living. She thought of the North the way a child thinks of a lost toy that was more than a toy. She let the memory be a live coal, and did not touch it until she knew what fire she wanted. At Dragonstone, Loras began to sit up. Pain had become his roommate. They agreed not to speak, unless necessary. He refused 2 visits from singers and accepted one from a squire who cried when he saw him and apologized. Do not apologize, Loras said kindly. It is boring to be brave all the time. He reached for the cup the boy held, and his fingers shook, and the boy pretended not to see, and that kindness turned Loras' eyes bright in a way Poppy never had. He slept then, and dreamed of a garden path he had run down as a boy, the striation in the dust, his mother's voice floating over a hedge like perfume. The High Septon wrote the Tyrells a letter of consolation that overused the word fortitude, and sealed it with a flourish. Olenna wrote back a note to his steward that asked whether the kitchens at the Sept preferred rosewater or orange blossom in their fritters, and did not mention fortitude at all. The thin priest counted the coins donated in the Tyrell's name and allocated half to purchase wool blankets. A woman with a cough received one and stopped coughing. A man whose wife had left him wrapped the blanket around emptiness and slept with his back against the wall, and felt for the first time in a month as if winter might be survivable. Faith is a ledger where kindness makes entries no one but the book sees. Cersei, starved of the clean satisfaction of her old enemy rising visibly against her, taught herself to enjoy subtler victories. She let a rumor slip that Marguerite preferred doves to hawks because doves are easier to feed. The rumor died because it wasn't sufficiently cruel to cling. She tried another, about the girls' dresses being paid for by the city. It prospered for a moment, and then fell away because Marguerite's girls were seen carrying flour with their sleeves rolled, and because the women who made the dresses took a perverse pride in charging less to make more, the way craftsmen do when they adopt a favorite rich patron and make her their marquis. She kept the Kettleblacks near and fed them meat and sharp looks, and enjoyed their wary obedience. She sharpened herself on the thought of Tyrion moving somewhere in the world like an infection, and the thought made her want to scrub every surface inside herself with wine and fire. She sat with Tommen in a window and showed him where the river darkened where it ran deeper. And he told her shyly he had learned all the King's Guard since the conquest, and could tell her 3 curious things about each. Kevin says trivia are a way to dress up ignorance. She said, and regretted it immediately, because the boy's face fell, and because she had heard her father's bite, and did not wish to be only his echo. She kissed his hair. Tell me, she said, and listened with a patience that felt like penance. In Dorne, Jaime chose an oath. In the Red Keep, Cersei chose a night to unveil a cask of wine that would make men speak their affections as if they had been recollected in tranquility. In the Vale, Elaine chose a gown that would suggest ripeness without promise. In the North, Jon chose to send a letter he knew would not persuade the man who would receive it, but might weigh slightly in the balance when a day came that would require weighing. Choices were the quiet machinery the world ran on. The city, which preferred spectacle, adjusted itself in its sleep to the decisions made in 4 different rooms. The tourney was followed by a hunt to celebrate nothing in particular except that men were still men and liked to ride to kill. Cersei did not ride. Margaery did, perched pretty as a banked flame, careful to not shoot, careful to laugh when a lordling missed. Tommen hit nothing, which made the men kinder to him than hitting would have. Strong rode as a guard. Silent and displacing air. A boar came out of a copse snorting prophecies and was diverted by a handful of men who needed to be brave in front of other men. The boar died with the irritation of one who had other plans. Later, the kitchen would perfume pears and roast them near the edge of the heat, and a man would lick his finger where the juice had burned him and think, there are worse places to be a man. That evening, with the smell of meat comforting the rooms, a letter arrived for Cersei from the Iron Bank, with a phrase that had more weight than she liked. Stocks of patience. She imagined men counting patience in a vault, wrapped in oiled cloth. She told Qyburn to write back and offer decorative gratitude. She told Pycelle to take a nap. She told herself that the last man who had truly frightened her had been her father, and he was dead, and she had survived that. She poured wine and felt steadier. Olenna, across the keep, wrote 3 notes, and then a 4th that she crumpled. She watched Margaery pour milk for the cat, who had found her bed, and thought, not for the first time, that the girl had the talent of seeming to do nothing while making rooms behave. He will come home, Olenna said suddenly, and realized she had meant to say it only to herself. Margaery smiled and did not turn her head. He will, she said, and we will let them have their song. What song? The one about a flower in winter, Margaery said. We'll let them have it. We'll write the last verse. The city settled to sleep as a man settles to a chair after supper. Not without a sigh or two, but grateful to not be required to stand. Strong stood in the darkness, a piece of furniture men forgot, until they turned and found the space he occupied had shape. Qyburn visited his chamber the way physicians visit patients and lovers visit clandestinely. Alert, careful, with a hand always already thinking about the next touch. He took a pulse where there was none and nodded. Excellent, he whispered to the air. We will make a legend of you yet. Caravans came in from the Roserad with frost on their barrel hoops. A girl sold roasted chestnuts by the sept and bit her own when no one was looking. A mother took her boy by the ear when he said a word she despised, and then, when he cried, held him in a half-minute of ferocity, in which her anger and her love fought, and love won by the width of a fingernail. A gold cloak bought a scarf, and told the woman selling it that his mother had knitted like that, and the woman said, "All mothers knit like that," and he smiled as if relieved to hear it. Somewhere under the keep, in a room where no bell reached, a rat climbed a wall it had climbed before. It paused as if listening to the city's breath, then moved on. In the morning, the crown loaves would be stamped again and distributed, and the stamp would be a fraction crooked, because the baker's boy had fallen briefly in love with the shape of the queen's hand when she showed him once how to press, and love always throws men's hands off true by a hair. No one would notice. The mouths would be full. The river would drag its birds over its surface like beads on a string. The day would make its choices, and the city would lean in, imperceptibly, to hear. Frost found the corners of the Red Keep first, a delicate net across stone that servants wiped away at dawn, with the same brisk economy they used for wax strips and spilled wine. The garden basins skinned over in the night, thinly, breaking under a fingertip. The sun hesitated on the eastern lip and then climbed. And the city coughed itself awake, baker smoke and tallow smoke, and wood smoke hanging in tiers above the alleys, like frayed banners that no wind bothered to claim. In the courtyard below Circe's solar, a hawker cried dates as if a summer caravan had only just turned the corner and would appear if he kept summoning it with his throat. She watched a while, not to be comforted, only to take the measure of what was hers. The loaves with the crown mark had become a rhythm. Every third day now. Smaller rounds, more frequent. The stamp a hair crooked where the baker's boy pressed with more pride than precision. Pride is always a little crooked. The small folk had learned the pattern and queued before the carts arrived. Eyes turned toward the red keep, as if to remind the stone that it owed them. She let them look. Looking cost her nothing. A servant brought a silver tray and a letter with a black ribbon, which was only a fashion these days. No one had died that she cared to name. She broke the seal and scanned the hand she knew as well as any man's. Littlefinger's courteous slopes and sly descents, words like coins that showed different faces depending on the light. He wrote of snow. The passes would close early. The Erie would be isolated. He would naturally secure the Vale's loyalties against winter hunger. He would arrange a gesture for the crown. A remission, a loan, a feast staged as a charity. Whichever would please her palate. He enclosed with the letter a sprig of something dried and sweet-smelling. Fennel, Dot. She smiled. Tell him the fennel delights me, she said when Qyburn slipped like a well-oiled hinge through the doorway. And tell him the crown prefers gestures, whose numbers add without tricks. Qyburn inclined his head, pleasantly unctuous. Ace your grace wishes. And the Kettleblacks. They have remembered their place, he said. One forgets how educable men become when their coin comes in the right purse at the right hour. Men forget everything that doesn't hurt, she said, and turned the letter so the light showed where the pen had paused. A hesitation before the word, loyalties. That was where Petier's real letter lay, in his pauses. Keep them close, but teach them by inches. I might ask them to remember things they were never present for. Danderal. Memory, Qyburn said, is a herb that thrives in the dark. Buy more of it, she said. He left, humming a womanless tune, and the door closed with a soft argument of wood. The room breathed warm. Down in the courtyard, a cat stalked with the deliberate arrogance of a thing that knows a queen has no power over it. Circe drank her wine and conjured the shape of Margaery's face when the first stone fell from a facade. She did not intend to use the faith. She had learned too much from her father to hand pikes to priests. Secular blades were blunter and safer to swing. At the sept, the High Septon's honey-colored jewel caught morning as if it contained separate suns. He blessed a basket of blankets as if wool and benediction had equal weight. The thin priest balanced ledgers on his knee and moved beans between bowls to show which alms would go where. The faithful came and went, knees creaking, voices thin with piety and phlegm. There were no sermons about steel. The High Septon liked figs, not swords. It suited the city to have its god plump and half asleep. Margaery read the weather differently. She liked to stand in shadows where the palace's latticework cut the light into manageable squares and speak with her girls in low voices. They had learned the city's alleys by their noses, which is the proper way to learn them. A girl with clever hands and a memory for faces watched the silk street. Another, born to a fishmonger with a good right arm for flinging, stood by the wharves to notice who unloaded at odd hours. A third kept an eye on a seamstress in the Street of Sisters who had quietly doubled her charges, and not for hems or sleeves. Threads tell, Margaery said, knotting her ribbon with a deftness that made the small folk think her simpler than she was. Follow where cloth thickens. Men wrap their lies in brocade. Tommen liked to accompany her to the kitchens when word went out that the bread would be stamped again. He grew more solemn in corridors where flour hung like mist. He would listen to the clatter of pans as if to music. Margaery let him lift a loaf still warm enough to startle his palms. She watched his eyes fill with purpose, light like a candle behind parchment. We feed them because we can. she told him. And because a king is not a king without mouths. In the evenings she would arrange stones in patterns for the boy, pyramids, lines, a river, and have him count them and move them with rules she invented, teaching him the shapes of choice without alarming him by naming the game. Elsewhere, Olenna trimmed rumors with scissors and let them fall where they would cut her enemy's ankles. Between them, they kept the Tyrell rose in a vase, where it could be admired and not easily plucked. The song about the night of flowers unthreaded itself in the taverns, and then, oddly, knotted again with a softer refrain. Loras had become a figure half mercy, half pride. Dragonstone made a shrine of him with the petty tenderness of garrisons and sick rooms. He held the pain like a prayer. His men told each other 3 conflicting tales every night. How he had laughed when his hair singed. How he had placed a hand on a boy's head and blessed him with ash. How he had wept when the poppy left him for an hour, and the world came back too clear to bear. Men need their saints to have some salt in them. Loras's salt was his vanity. He lives, the letters insisted. He lives and will ride. When those words reached Marguerite, she pressed them like a posy under a book, and would not let them go. Circe heard them and heard the danger under the hope. A living Loras was a blade, even scorched. A dead Loras was a relic. Relics are powerful in cities that remember kings and have too many bells. She decided, therefore, that Loras must live in a way useful to her. Either too ruined to be of use to others, or too distant to be near. She sharpened her plans as a man sharpens a quill, shaving curlings away till the point shows. Jamie wrote from Dorne with a hand steadier than his heart. The Water Gardens had taught him a patience he hadn't thought he possessed. He sat with Doran Martell under lemon trees and learned to speak in paragraphs, each clause placed like a stone in a wall to see if the structure would hold. "We will not war," Doran said, and Ariohota stood behind him like a single word that would end discussions if necessary. "We will not let the sea bring us queens," Doran added. And Jamie understood that Myrcella's value here was not only to him. He understood too that the scar at her ear had made her older by exactly that much metal and blood, and that the girl he had come to fetch was no longer precisely the girl he loved, and that such is the definition of children. He saw Arianne watching him the way a woman watches the angle of a blade. He gave her courtesy, and saw in her eyes the knowledge of courtesies used as coin. He did not like the sand snakes, and did not hate them. He feared only the world in which his daughter was made a symbol again. "If the princess must travel," Doran said at last, "she will travel as a Martell and as a Baratheon, with honor. We will send Nymeria as an envoy and Ario as her shadow. If the king's word is good, the road will be safe." It was a stalling tactic with olive oil rubbed into it. Jamie knew it, and, surprisingly, did not mind. He had not come to Dorne to break anything he could not put back together with his one hand. He wrote back to Circe. Language of arrangements, safe conducts, mutual assurances, the promise of oaths, no admission of need. He enclosed a brief line to Tommen describing the sound of orange leaves when the wind moves them at noon. A sound like rain that decided to be kind. Tommen traced the line with a forefinger as if the sound would enter him through the skin. In the Vale, snow came and stayed, and children learned to love it while men learned to fear it. Elaine's cheeks bloomed under the cold. She rehearsed her smile until it no longer felt like a rehearsed thing. Littlefinger shaped a feast the way a gambler shapes dice. He arranged for Harry the heir to arrive as if by his own will, with hawks and laughter, and the careless arrogance young men wear to show they belong to their horses. "Your hair like this," he said to Elaine, arranging a single lock to darken one eye. "Leave a ribbon loose. Men like to think that they have discovered something everyone else has missed." "What should I say?" she asked. "Nothing true," he said with a grin. "Only kind things spoken in a low voice." She curtsied to Harry with rose-lace hands and watched him watch himself in her gaze. Boys like to be handsomer in women's eyes. Later, when she found him looking at a window instead of at her, she spoke instead to a man old enough to be her father, who owned nothing but 3 small parcels of stony ground and the vote in a moot court that came with them. She asked him about ice in the furrows and the way ponies grow winter coats too late when the winters are wrong. By the time Harry next looked at her, She had become in the room a woman other men wished to stand near. Littlefinger across the floor lifted his cup the width of a finger. Sansa, inside the gown, breathed and did not shake. Back in King's Landing, a seamstress in the Street of Sisters took a commission she would refuse to speak about and stitched an extra inside pocket into a guardsman's jerkin. She did it with small neat stitches, proud of her craft even when craft was applied to something she suspected would sour the mouth. The guardsman brought the jerkin to a lesser kettle black, with an expression that tried to convey he was doing more than his duty. The lesser kettle black, having offended a whore who'd told him secrets because he had paid her, and she had told him because she was tired of keeping them, thought to restore himself in the Queen Regent's eyes by arranging to have nothing to confess but the names she preferred. Qyburn watched the arrangement like a gardener watches a frost that will finish off a root he never liked. Cersei invited the girl Blue Bard to sing in the Queen's Solar one afternoon, when only 3 listeners sat: herself, Margaery, and Olenna. The bard sang 2 songs suited to old women and 1 suited to girls, and then, with a delicacy that suggested the presence of instructions, a new composition that praised lilies in such a way that the roses could be inferred if one chose to infer them. Olenna ate candied orange peel and smiled with all the satisfaction of a woman examining a knife and determining it was dull. Margaery clapped lightly after each verse and complimented the tuning of the lute. "I do love the sounds of winter," she said. "When the hearth eats wood like a beast, when the wind argues with shutters, when girls sing in rooms like this and the city outside thinks itself forgotten." "Do you?" Cersei asked. "I prefer summer. Heat makes men foolish. One learns so much." "I like both," Margaery said. "Why choose?" "Because you must," Cersei thought, and smiled with her teeth. "We should choose a feast day for the court. The city needs reminding that kings are not only duties." The High Septon assured me that the 7 approve of pleasures within measure. "Then shower. We shall give them both," Margaery said, rising in a swirl of green. "Pleasures and measures." When she had gone, Olenna tapped the table. "Pretty," she said, "is not harmless." "Pretty," Cersei said, "is a kind of armor." "And yours?" Olenna asked, looking like an old cat sunning itself in a doorway, knowing precisely where every movement in the street would end. "Mine is steel," Cersei said. "And a son." Olenna smiled thoughtfully, which is to say, as if the thought might bite. "Sons grow," she said, "and steel rusts." "They do," Cersei agreed, "if ill kept." The feast day Cersei designed had 3 parts: morning piety to cool the city, a midday of bread and small entertainments to soothe it, and an evening of spectacle to remind it how far it sat from kings and queens. She wanted Strong to stand behind her chair with his iron face and let the light find him twice: once when he was motionless and terrible, once when he moved like an idea made flesh. She called to mind the sound of men sucking in breath when awe becomes fear. At dawn, the High Septon's hands trembled over bowls of perfumed water, and the faithful pressed forward with a vigor more suited to carnivals. At noon, jugglers threw knives and caught them. Tommen laughed when a man pretended to drop one and looked disappointed when the man succeeded every time. Margaery fed a swan with a sly tenderness and let the bird nip her fingertip. The gasp that went up from the courtyard tasted of honey and alarm. Guard captains drilled their men noisily in places where women could see. Cersei had placed them there. At dusk, torches flared along the lists. The air pricked with cold. The crowd breathed steam. The first collision sent splinters like bees. When Strong took the field, quiet fell as if cut with a knife. Tommen stood and then sat and stood again, the way boys do when the body cannot bear to be courteous. The giant lowered his lance as if bowing to an altar and shattered a man from his horse with a precision that felt like blasphemy. Men roared because noise is the city's answer to fear. Cersei did not move. She had taught herself not to exult. Exultation reveals. After, in the hall, while platters steamed and strings sang, a watch captain entered with a man between his men, grubby and important. The man was a kettle black, but not the main one. His mouth was split, but from jest, not blows. He glanced up at the dais, and being a fool, smiled at Cersei. He had a purse with him, which had been put into the extra pocket by the seamstress, and within the purse, a bit of parchment with the shape of a queen's hand in words not easily proved or disproved. An assignation, an hour, a door. A second bit of parchment hid in his boot with a different hand naming a different door and a different woman. Qyburn spoke the man's name with a small sigh. The room turned to listen. Cersei rose halfway, measured the distance to Margaery with her eyes, saw the Queen of Thorns cock her head like a bird, saw Tommen glance between the women, and sat again. "Take him below," she said softly. "This is not a room for dirt." The man bleated a protest, the kind men make when they realize they are not clever. He managed to say a name, Margaery's, before Boros Blount clapped a meaty hand over his mouth. The room rippled. It is the nature of rooms to behave like water when stones drop in them. Cersei kept her profile serene and counted 3, then 5, before she allowed herself to meet Margaery's gaze. The girl did not flinch. Olenna did not blink. Tommen looked frightened, which would do. Fear makes boys better listeners. In the morning, the city had a new hum. The bard's chain glinted as he avoided certain rhymes. 2 bakers argued in the street about whether a queen who fed you could do as she liked in private. "She cannot," said one. "She can," said the other. A washerwoman told her friend that queens are like wells. You drink and give thanks and do not ask where the water springs from, unless the water tastes wrong. In the Sept, the High Septon preached temperance while staring at a woman whose hair reminded him of a girl from years ago. The memory made his tongue clumsy. Cersei did not bring a case to the High Septon. She brought a case to the hall. The small council met with air like ice water, and Olenna and Mace arrived not as petitioners, but as waits. Kevin took his chair and became a ledger. Pycelle coughed and caught the cough like a ball and put it away. Qyburn stood at Cersei's shoulder and radiated that peculiar comfort men feel in rooms where the instruments have been laid out on a cloth. "The watch detained a man last night," Cersei began, bearing evidence of treasonous familiarity with the queen. She let the word treason rest delicately, like the place a surgeon presses a throat to check a pulse. "We will examine the man. We will examine his confederates. We will do so in the calm light of the law." "Whose law?" Olenna asked silky soft. "The king's," Cersei said. "And the realms?" "Not the gods then," Olenna said as if relieved. "Good. The gods are poor lawyers." Margaery sat with her hands placed where the light brightened them. "Let the man speak," she said. "If he lies, the lie will look a certain way. If he tells truth, it will look another. Truth and lies have clever disguises," Cersei said. "It helps to strip them." "Do it then," Margaery said, and did not lower her eyes. "Strip it all." In the cells, the kettle black looked less sure. Men who speak mistakenly for coin find their mouths dry when asked to speak for their lives. Qyburn gave him water and watched how he drank, and then he spoke to him in a voice that made ordinary words seem like gifts. Comfort, confession, remission, all the false saints' vocabulary repurposed for a different altar. The man told the story he had been taught with the right pauses. He avoided certain names with the clumsy grace of men, avoiding pits they have not stepped in before. He showed the parchment. He did not know about the second parchment in his boot. Qyburn had a boy fetch it and allowed himself inward satisfaction when it said what it needed to say about another queen's door. 2 doors are always better than one. One will open. By noon the court was ready to hear part of it. Mace thundered about slanders. Olenna sat with a needle in her sleeve. Kevin insisted the testimony be taken in writing and under multiple seals. Tommen looked to his mother, and then to his wife, and looked pained by the geometry. Cersei guided him with her hand at his shoulder. Margaery guided him with her voice praising his fairness. Between the two, the boy found himself kingly, simply by being tugged. It did not happen at once. It never does. Days gathered, each dropping one small certainty and picking up a different piece, until the puzzle on the table no longer matched the picture on the box. A lesser kettleblack disappeared into a cell and did not come out. An officer of the watch suddenly remembered he had been elsewhere the night in question, and had witnesses who owed him coin. A seamstress took to her bed and would not see callers. A girl in Marguerite's train prayed aloud every morning at a particular window, until men learned to avoid the corridor for fear of becoming part of a story they did not want. The High Septon wrote a letter to no one in particular, deploring scandal, and the letter was read aloud in a tavern, to laughter because, as every tavern-goer knows, scandal is the bread that comes, even when the ovens fail. Loris's ship made the mouth of the Blackwater under a sky, the color of pewter. He would not permit a litter. He stood between two squires and walked down the plank and took the cheers as if each shout were a coin, part payment on a debt he had begun to suspect he owed to too many. His beauty had been tempered into something more austere. The scars had not ruined him. They had refined him toward an icon. Marguerite went to him with all the artless speed of a girl in a story, and stopped the correct distance from his body. A queen must be seen to maintain kingdoms, even in embraces. He kissed her brow. She tasted ash, and understood that this would remain in him as surely as a needle remains in a garment sewn in haste. Circe received him as custom demanded and smiled with all courtesy. "The realm thanks you," she said. "The realm notes your courage." "Courage is cheaper than it looks," Loris said, voice even. "It can be borrowed. It must be paid back." "By whom?" she asked. "Whoever was brave enough to lend it," he said lightly. And the girls in green behind Marguerite smiled, as if he had told a private joke to which only they were entitled. He slept that night in a dark room that smelled faintly of tallow and broth. Pain came and went with the regularity of a tide. In an hour before dawn, when even cats are disinclined to prowl, he woke without hurt for the first time in months and wept in a single quiet breath, and then laughed at himself for being relieved that crying could still come when one had use for it. In the morning, he dressed in white and went to the White Sword Tower to rest a hand on the book that had made saints of liars and kept honest men at the edge of madness, and vowed again, to the page and to himself, to be a wall for a king he liked more than any other he had served. The other knights rose when he came in. Strong stood in a corner like a piece of the room the masons had never finished. "In your time away," Balanswan said, "we acquired a new brother." "So I see," Loris said, and studied the iron face with that cool politeness a man uses for a painting he suspects of being poorly done. "Has he a voice?" "No," Marintrant said. "He has principles." Loris smiled and did not answer. He took up the quill and wrote a line, neat even with the hand that had trembled yesterday when it touched a cup. The book took the ink and kept its counsel. News from Doran came as a compromise no one would dance to and everyone would watch. Myrcella would be allowed to travel under terms a lawyer could build a house on and a poet could live in without rent. She would come with Tristane and Nymeria, with Martel banners and royal ones, with a solemnity that would make knives look foolish. Jaime would accompany her. Doran would send Hota. "It will be a procession," Bronn said, bored and pleased at once. "Processions are where people like us notice who stumbles." Circe disliked processions she had not designed. She wrote to sunset-hued Dorn with a courtesy sharpened to a pin. She wrote to the captains of the city watch, with instructions disguised as questions. She wrote to Qeburn with no words at all, sending only a grape skinned neatly, laid on a plate, to remind him how certain operations are to be performed, cleanly, without bruising the flesh around the wound. In the Vale, Littlefinger's feast succeeded as designed. Harry was led toward Elaine by the crowd's approval, the way a colt is led to water by younger boys cheering. He said the things boys say to girls whose voices make them think of orchards. She said the things girls say who have learned that a sentence cut short invites a man to finish it in the direction you wish. "The North," she said once, without adding a question, and let the word hang like a fruit. He looked at it, interested, then remembered the Vale and his pride, and named 3 mountain passes, as if naming were owning. She applauded. Later, alone, she rewrote the scene in her mind with different words, and the same smile, and said a prayer she did not direct to any god she had been taught to name. Jon Snow stood on the wall, and the world below lay white and ruled with gray lines. The trees, thin grammar. He met with Tormund Giantsbane and 2 other men whose scars told stories in a language the South had never learned, and he spoke in the slow, careful cadence of men who have decided to risk the next year for the sake of the next 10. Bring them, he said to Tormund. South. Children first, then women, then the men who will swear to leave their spears bundled. We will find them land in the gift. We will find them timber and seed. We will find a way. Will you find more food? Dolorous Ed asked later, cheerfully dismal. I always do, Jon said, not smiling, because he had to now. He wrote a letter to a lord in the north whose words had recently grown stiffer with each reply, and another to a crofter whose son had served 2 years at the Shadow Tower, and had left it alive with a limp and a story about how the cold can sound like singing when you are near death. He sent a raven to the queen that he knew would not be read by the person he wished. He stood with Ghost until the sun, bruised fruit, sank, and the wind told him nothing he had not already learned with his bones. In King's Landing, the first mice made bold for the kitchens. The cats grew fat. The city wrapped itself in winter with its usual theatricality, making a show of its shivers. Marguerite distributed cloaks as well as bread. The Queen of Thorns criticized the stitch on the hems and let no one see when she paid a seamstress privately to correct what she criticized in public. Loras sparred a little under Balin's eye and did not show how one cut still wanted to reopen when he twisted wrong. Tommen learned how to write his name with a flourish that would be copied by clerks onto 1,000 decrees he would never read. Kevin attempted to draft one that would pay the Iron Bank in parts and was told, gently, that the bank did not eat crusts, it ate bread. Pycelle fell asleep over a list and woke with ink on his beard and told no one the dream he'd had, which had involved a golden hand falling and shattering like glass. Cersei chose her moment to pull the first thread. It was small, nothing in itself. A maid who had been seen in the wrong corridor at the wrong hour. A boy who had the wrong habit of telling stories for silver. A kettleblack who remembered he had a spine, if not a brain. She arranged for the maid to be summoned and questioned in a room with windows open, so the city's noise could wander in and make the girl feel less protected by walls. She had Qyburn place on the table a small bowl of sugared almonds, which the girl would not touch, a plate of dried apricots, which she would, and then a jug of watered wine, which would make her tongue softer. She placed her own hands on the table where the girl could see the rings. She spoke with a kindness that had cut men to the bone. Names, Cersei said finally, when she had used up all the small gentlenesses. The girl gave 2 and then a third, voice catching, watching Cersei's face for approval, the way a dog watches a man's hands. None of the names were high enough to satisfy. They were small. Cersei took them anyway. Small names make ladders, she said when the girl had gone. We will climb. Olenna learned of it that night, of course. She had a taste for ladders too. She preferred to pull them away once she and hers had reached a gallery. We will keep the girl with us, she told Marguerite after. She will be safer in our sight. I would rather she were safe in herself, Marguerite said. Olenna looked at her granddaughter with that affection old women sometimes have when they see in young women not their own faces, but a new, alarming decency. The world doesn't teach that safety, she said. It teaches the other. In Dorne, Myrcella stood on a balcony and watched a pale moon rise, and told Trystane a story about a cat in King's Landing who had refused to be reduced by kings. Trystane laughed and promised to buy her a cat when they reached the capital. She told him she might prefer a hawk. He told her hawks sometimes leave you for the sky. She said, so do daughters, and regret moved through the air like a moth no one could catch. Jaime, passing by, heard her and did not stop. The procession north would move as slowly as a pageant through thick snow, banners half stiff with frost. Hata would scan the white edges for knives. Nymeria would rehearse her words about terms and justice until she could say them with the exact heat that would warm and not burn. Jaime would watch Marcella for signs of sorrow he could not mend and would count horses and maps instead because numbers are a mercy. Bronn would gamble at the inns and win exactly enough to keep the table lively. Doran would sit with his hands folded and feel the ache in his joints that was not only gout. In the Red Keep, Strong stood without moving, and the rumor went that he slept standing, that he did not eat, that he had once briefly put a hand against a wall when the torches guttered and the stone had groaned. Qyburn heard the rumor and marked down which men repeated it with the bright eyes of boys at a fair. He adjusted a salve for Winterburn and smiled when the smell of mint and some darker thing perfumed his rooms like a hidden chapel. The first cold rain in a fortnight broke and ran off the tiles in the women's garden. Marguerite with her girls walked under an awning and tasted the wet at the back of her throat. "We will hold a winter fair," she said suddenly, and the girls made the happy noises girls make when games are promised. Skaters on boards if the pond freezes, warm sweet wine for the old, meat pies for the watch at half price. She enumerated the gifts like a litany. "We will invite the septi to bless it," she added calmly, and her girls glanced at one another and pressed lips together to hide smiles. Cersei heard of the plan and approved it with the grace of a queen who allows others to decorate a room she has already chosen. "Let them skate," she said. "Let them sing. Let them praise the Tyrells. They will go home and lock their doors against the night and pray the crown keeps the wolves out." She wrote a note to the captain of the watch to triple the men on the river gate, and another to Qyburn to bring her a certain salve for winter skin, and an entirely different salve for making men's tongues sincere. Under a pale noon that made everyone look briefly older, Loras took the field again in practice armor, and moved with the care of a man who had learned that bodies change their faithfulness when tested by fire. He smiled more with his eyes than his mouth. He spoke with Balin, and let Trent be fools, where fools keep themselves safe. He put a hand briefly on Tommen's shoulder and told him the names of 3 horses that had saved their riders' lives in the year of drought, and a boy's heart lit with that particular light boys have when given lore instead of law. Marguerite watched from a balcony and felt gratitude so clean it could be poured. Night brought a brief stab of wind from the sea that rattled signs on their hooks in the street of flour. A child somewhere coughed themselves awake and then fell back to sleep. A man in the watch bought a jug and brought it home and sat with his back to a wall and did not drink it because he liked the feeling of knowing he could and choosing not to. A seamstress rose from her bed in the Street of Sisters and went to her door and put her palm against it, as if to measure whether the wood would hold when pushed. A rat took a second path for the first time in a week, and a cat noticed. These are important things, though no one marks them when they happen. In the morning, the crown loaves bore their crooked stamp again, and the line on the Street of Flour wrapped once around a corner, and then back on itself like a snake biting its tail. Cersei stood on her balcony and held her wine fast, so her hand would not shake from the winter's bite. She had chosen several paths and set men and women upon them. Now she watched to see how they would walk. She did not consider whether the paths had been laid for her. The city nudged a fraction. That was all. A careful shift. A dancer makes on the boards, when she knows the next step is the one her partner will miss if she does not save them both. The bells of the sept rang with cheerful emptiness. Somewhere below, the iron-faced giant turned toward a sound no one else heard, and then turned back, patient as gravity. Jaime's last letter before the road north arrived at dusk when lamp wicks were being pinched alight. He wrote briefly, "Words for Tommen. I will stand at your side when you kneel before the seven at your next feast day. I will tell you a story about a fish. Words for Cersei. We will be seen. Keep the city steady. Do not make me choose between my honor and my daughter." He regretted the last sentence before the ink dried and did not sand it as he should have. Cersei read it with a cool face, and then, when the room was empty, crushed the letter in her fist. Then smoothed it, then crushed it again, as if she could teach the paper a lesson about obedience. Littlefinger's essences finally arrived in a lacquered box with trivial compartments and delightful lies. Fennel, rose, cedar, a whisper of clove. Cersei let the scents breathe and then closed the box. "We will use none of them," she said to the empty room, and the room seemed to approve. Pettyr wrote that he would come with the thaw, that he would bring the Vale's men and a child's gratitude for the chance to serve, that he had, by the by, acquired a charming little volume of songs that might please the king's ear. Olenna, told of it, clicked her tongue and counted her own measures. The city held, for now, in the balance between two women and their different crafts. Snow did not fall in King's Landing that week, though it thought about it. A flurry came and then turned to rain like a promise hedged by caution. In the north, the snow had no doubts. In the Vale, it made lace on the eaves. In Dorne, the orange leaves rustled like small paper promises. On the wall, the cold sang. In the Riverlands, a raven choosing a branch hesitated, and then settled on a different one. And the blackfish walked the battlements of Riverrun with the patient obstinacy of an old stone who knows the river saves its sharpest knives for the arrogant. Frey riders told each other lewd jokes, and not one of them laughed with their eyes. Cersei went to sleep with a mind full of lines, threads, ropes, reins, and dreamed an ordinary dream about a corridor in which every door opened to reveal the same room, empty, clean, with a window looking east. She woke before dawn, calm in the body, calculated in the head. Her father would have been pleased with the arithmetic if he had had any use for praise. Tywin's ghost did not haunt her. It waited like a judge, silent, deep in the place where women keep voices they will never allow to be heard aloud. She rose and dressed, and took the day like a knife she knew how to use. The city answered. It always does. It lowered its head to the harness and pulled. It sang. It lied. It ate. It watched. It passed rumors like cups. It warmed its hands on other people's fires. It prayed without belief, and believed without praying. Men with secrets kept them badly. Women with power wore it like hairpins, visible, delicate-looking, lethal. The High Septon blessed, and then slept. Qyburn wrote down one more observation that would make sense to him alone. Strong stood till the light caught the edge of iron, and made it momentarily seem human. The bells put their thin music into the air, and the air did not argue. And outside the walls, far along the Roserad, a procession with banners and a girl with a scar at the ear moved through a corridor of frost, in which every breath hung like a held word, and within that breath walked a man who had once knelt in blood and killed a king and been called what he had been called ever since, and who now, because time has ways of making echoes, found he wanted only to bring a child. He looked north, as men do when the pieces of their life are arranged ahead of them and not behind, and felt, in the hard cage of his chest, the slow, surprising weight of hope.